Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more Esoterica. Today we're diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium Cunctionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, the link for my book where I teach you to do magic responsibly, and the links for getting in contact with me directly so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of Mysterium Cunctionis with Chapter 4, Part 7, the relation of the king symbol to consciousness. The apotheosis of the king, the renewed rising of the sun, means, on our hypotheses, that a new dominant of consciousness has been produced and that the psychic potential is reversed. Consciousness is no longer under the dominion of the unconscious, in which state the dominant is hidden in the darkness, but has now glimpsed and recognized a supreme goal. The apotheosis of the king depicts this change, and the resultant feeling of renewal is expressed nowhere more plainly than in some of our loveliest chorals. Ripley's Cantilena includes Mother Luna, the maternal aspect of night, in this transfiguration, which reminds us of the apotheosis at the end of Faust II. It is as though the moon is risen in the night with as much splendor as the sun, and just as the queen flows with all delicious unguent, so, in the acts of Thomas, a sweet smell pours from the heavenly goddess. Footnote 378. That is just a reference to the apocryphal New Testament. We'll be back at 380. All right, so the apotheosis of the king, the renewed rising of the sun, the dominant consciousness being produced. All of those are taking deliberate intention in your own life. It is guiding and directing your own direction. It is going in the direction that you want to, right? It is no longer relying upon the unconscious to make your decisions for you or to get you in and out of situations, but instead to do that for yourself. We discussed that quite extensively as we have gone through. I don't know if it's been in quite those terms, but that is what it is, right? It is you taking responsibility for your own life. That is the apotheosis. This next part, the apotheosis of the king depicts this change. That part is true, even if I don't think he had the full understanding of that. The resultant feeling of renewal expressed nowhere more plainly than in the loveliest chorals. Now, that is poems, that is songs, that is the things that we make to describe, and it is limited by our understandings, just like in the Cantilena, which we just spent almost 5 days on, right? There are definitely some extracts of wisdom that can be pulled from that, but it is not like good. It is not good analogies. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Some of them rely upon a key, which I am pretty sure that I do not have. But the parts that I did have a key for, they do indeed comport. But his expression of what the Cantilena means, like, in all honesty, for the most part, the Cantilena could have been left out of this book entirely. We would have been better served by doing a more extensive view of Dorn than doing the Cantilena by Ripley. That's not to say that Ripley didn't have some good information. We did spend a good bit of time. We extracted a lot of meat from it. But most of the meat was spent in clarifying what was probably meant as opposed to what was definitely said. And that is a big problem, right? I prefer it to be clear. I understand the reasons why it wasn't, but I prefer clear, right? I prefer it to be stated as opposed to inferred. And the Cantilena was more about the inference than it was about the stating. And so, she is not only the mother, but the Kore, daughter of the light. She is the Gnostic, Sophia, who corresponds to the alchemical mother. If our interpretation of King Saul is correct, 380, the coincidence of the apotheosis of the king with the birth of Christ is indicated in Diespagnet. But lastly, the opus comes to an end in the other royal throne of Jove, from which our most mighty king shall receive a crown adorned with most precious rubies. Thus, in its own footsteps does the year revolve upon itself. Jove was a Greek god, right? He was mentioned quite extensively when we went through the Iliad, right? We read through the Iliad, and Jove is the supreme god of the Greeks. And so having a reference in here to Christ is a little bit wild to me, right? It makes absolutely no sense. The Greeks and the belief in Jove was gone, pretty much, right? The Romans came after and replaced all of the gods. They were no longer called by the old names. And so this is just resurrecting something and inserting it into something else that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You can absolutely read into the allegory of Christ that there is the rebirth and it should be symbolical, but that is not what is told by the text, and that is the problem with the text, right? It is portraying this one man as the salvation of all mankind, and that is not correct. What is correct is that you have a chance for yourself to become the new man through resurrection through God. That is an allegory that is contained within the Gospels, but it is one that you most definitely have to work to extract. It is not something that is self-evident upon the face of it itself. And that is one of the major problems with that particular religion, right? And by that particular religion, I encompass all of the many thousands of variations of it. And so this reference right here has no real good reason, right? Our interpretation of King Saul is correct. If you are interpreting him as anything related to Christ, you are doing it wrong. Then the apotheosis must also have made Mother Luna visible. That is to say, made the unconscious conscious. Now, he is trying to shoehorn the esoteric into the physical. Psychoanalysis absolutely has its place, without a doubt, no doubt whatsoever. But it is not here, right? It is not in this context. It is not in this way. What is being talked about with King Saul and with the Mother Luna is the as above power and the as below power, the positive and the negative, the creative and the absorptive, the generative, right? The nurturative, the masculine and the feminine. And so those two powers are a thing. They are something that I emphatically stand upon. And that understanding makes these other things make sense. This understanding here, not really. I mean, kind of. You can look at soul as consciousness and Luna as unconsciousness. You can make that assumption, but it is an assumption, right? It is not necessarily a one-on-one correlation. There is unconscious acts, there are conscious acts, there are subconscious acts, there are superconscious acts. These are all things. They all exist within you. Then it is all part of you. It is not just the two, but it is four at least, maybe even more. And so this is an allegory. It can be extracted, right, if that is what you are looking for. I am looking for the alchemical things, and the alchemical things and the Bible are not necessarily aligned correctly. And so, on top of that, the unconscious conscious interaction in the way that he is describing it is not quite correct, right? This was him and Freud really did come up with this concept, and so they were fleshing it out. There was still some more to be done. I don't necessarily hold that it is a good correlation, but it is one that does work, right? If you are seeking enlightenment, you are taking charge of your unconscious. That is part of it. That is the balancing process, no longer allowing the unconscious to rule you. And you can look at it in these physical terms, but I just don't. And I'm not trying to say that it is wrong necessarily, right? There are other things that are wrong, right? Thinking that somebody else has to sacrifice themselves for you to be forgiven from sin is wrong. It is intrinsically flawed. There is a major problem with that. This is not that, right? It can be that way if you were looking for it that way, and it does work, even as not quite the truth. It does work as a way to arrive at the truth. And so there is nothing wrong with looking at it this way. I just like to clarify that I look at it more on the spiritual side than I do on the therapy side. And that isn't, again, not to say that the therapy is not necessary. That is an extremely necessary part of life. If you are not going to talk therapy to talk out your issues, it's going to be a lot harder for you to work out those issues. I highly recommend talk therapy. But also, if your therapist is just trying to put you onto drugs, they're probably doing the wrong thing. And if you are on the drugs for more than a year or two, they're definitely doing the wrong thing. All right, back to the text. What at first seems a contradiction in terms resolves itself on closer examination as the coming into consciousness of an essential content of the unconscious. It is primarily the feminine element in man, the anima. Now, this designation of masculine, feminine, not necessarily a good one. I mean, it does kind of work, right? The feminine is the more passive. That would be the unconscious. It makes sense, but to attribute to those particular elements to it really makes you think that more of the feminine traits are going to signify unconscious, and that's not true. Nurturing is not an unconscious act. It is something that you do, and that is something that is intrinsically on the feminine side of things. Protectiveness is masculine. Nurturing is feminine. It is kind of opposite ends of the same coin. Not necessarily, but close. And so I don't like attributing that, the conscious and unconscious, to the masculine and feminine. And that those traits are not interchangeable. Footnote 381. The anima mediates between consciousness and collective unconscious, just as the persona does between the ego and the environment. And that is just terms, right? That is possible. We may get into some more of this analytical psychology, which is where this comes from, right? I do plan on getting into a lot more Jung. I'm not sure where we're going next. We will see how it goes. We may wind up doing some Dorn. Primarily the feminine element in man, the anima, that becomes visible. Secondly, the moonlight, which enables us to see in the dark and represents an illumination of the unconscious, or its permeability to light. And thirdly, the moon stands for the rotundum, about which I have written in Psychology and Alchemy. Footnote 382. Just giving you the paragraphs. I am so sorry. In the sublunary world, her roundness, plenilunium, circulus lunaris, footnote 283, or 383. See Albertus Magnus, Super Arborum Aristotelius. The stork sat there, as if calling itself the circle of the moon. The stork, like the swan and goose, has a maternal significance. In the sublunary world, her roundness corresponds as the mirror image of the sun to the anthropos, the psychological self or psychic totality. The moon is the connecting link between the concept of the Virgin Mother and that of the child, who is round, whole, and perfect. The new birth from the moon can therefore be expressed as much by the Christian's joy at Eastertide as by the mystic dawn, the aurora consurgens. For the risen king is the soul which is infused into the dead stone. 384. That is from Turbum. We'll be back at 386. The idea of roundness is also found in the crown, symbol of the kingship. Corona Regis is cited as synonymous with ashes, body, sea salt, mother, and blessed virgin, and is thus identified with the feminine element. All right, there are masculine and feminine elements in geometry, right? People look at it that way. And if it is round, it is feminine. If it is square, it is masculine. That is the way that it is looked at in sacred geometry. There are reasons for that. Most of them have to do with perpendicularity and the way that it interacts, right? It is more of a masculine trait to come in at an angle than it is to come in at a roundness. Okay, whatever. That is just an arbitrary designation. It is something that we use, but it is not something that is intrinsically true. Right? Many of these things that is being described here, we have attributed to these traits, but isn't, again, not necessarily true. The idea of roundness is found in the crown. That is true, and it is a symbol of kingship. But the Corona Regis being cited as synonymous with ashes, body, sea, salt, mother, and blessed virgin. Right, now this blessed virgin I dismiss completely. That is the archetype of the mother of the void, and that is fine. But this is an anthropomorphization of that I do not agree with at all. There was no virgin birth. That was a bad idea, right? The entirety of that was non-working, right? I understand that it worked for a few thousand years. It did not work well, right? We do not have enlightenment due to that. And so there is definitely some issues with the whole mother virgin, right? You're not a mother and a virgin, period. The end. Doesn't work. I don't care what your belief system was. I have went through the example. There was no prophecy for that. And so some of this works, some of it doesn't. That's all I'm saying, right? The designations that we give for the masculine and feminine attributes are just us arbitrarily assigning them. Sometimes there is reasoning, but that doesn't mean that it is true, right? Even when I'm talking about this, right? We have what I consider to be the masculine powers at the top, symbolized by this white circle here, and the feminine powers, symbolized by the black circle at the bottom. That is just me arbitrarily designating masculine and feminine. Those are not male and female, right? They are powers, they are forces. I am attributing these things to them because of what they do. The dark absorbs the light. Therefore, it is feminine to me because it absorbs. It takes within itself to create. The light penetrates into. That's a rather masculine trait. And so I view it in that way. But it can just as easily be the other way. It can just as easily be that the white is at the bottom and the black is at the top. That is how you see it. That is how you imagine it. It is how you use it, even. But it is arbitrary. There are two forces, I believe. There are one at the top and one at the bottom, I believe, right? There is the penetrative light and the void at the bottom. These are things that I believe, but it is not something that you have to, right? I relay this information so that you can use it if you find it useful, and it may be that you find it more useful to do it in the exact opposite way. I'm not here to judge that, right? I'm here to judge this literature that is telling you the wrong things. The important part of this is that the entirety of masculine and feminine being attributed to any of these forces is arbitrary. It is because of our belief about what those things mean, and that is not necessarily true. Mothers protect as well. All right, back to the text. This peculiar relationship between rotundity and the mother is explained by the fact that the mother, the unconscious, is the place where the symbol of wholeness appears. The fact that the rotundum is, as it were, contained in the anima and is prefigured by her lends her that extraordinary fascination which characterizes the eternal feminine in the good as well as the bad sense. At a certain level, therefore, woman appears as the true carrier of the longed-for wholeness and redemption. The starting point of our explanation is that the king is essentially synonymous with the sun, and that the sun represents the daylight of the psyche, consciousness, which, as the faithful companion of the sun's journey, rises daily from the ocean of sleep and dream, and sinks into it again at evening. Just as in the round dance of the planets and in the star-strewn spaces of the sky, the sun journeys along as a solitary figure, like any other one of the planetary archons, so consciousness, which refers everything to its own ego as the center of the universe, is only one among the archetypes of the unconscious, comparable to the King Helios of post-classical syncreticism, whom we meet in Julian the Apostate, for instance. This is what the complex of consciousness would look like if it could be viewed from one of the other planets, as we view the sun from the earth. The subjective ego personality, in example, consciousness and its contents, is seen in its various aspects by an unconscious observer, or rather, by an observer placed in the outer space of the unconscious. That this is so is proved by dreams, in which the conscious personality, the ego of the dreamer, is seen from a standpoint that is toto colio, different from that of the conscious mind. Such a phenomenon could not occur at all unless there were in the unconscious other standpoints opposing or competing with ego consciousness. These relationships are aptly expressed by the planet simile. The king represents ego consciousness, the subject of all subjects, as an object. His fate in mythology portrays the rising and setting of this most glorious and most divine of all the phenomena of creation, without which the world would not exist as an object. For everything that is only is because it is, directly or indirectly known, and moreover this knownness is sometimes represented in a way which the subject himself does not know, just as if he were being observed from another planet, now with the benevolent and now with sardonic gaze. All right, so this is all allegory of how to look at how you think, right? And I don't have a whole lot to add to this. This is fairly well done. Yes, right? You do have thoughts that are unconscious to you. You do sometimes recognize them, even if you don't recognize the source. You take unconscious actions all of the time. If there is a sound, for instance, your conditioning over time will have you to react to that sound. Let's say it is a loud, explosive sound. If you have grown up around a lot of violence, you may take it for gunshots and get defensive. If you have not, you will not do so. That is an unconscious reaction that you can recognize and that you can source, right? But you may not realize that. You may not even realize that you understand that there is danger from this loud sound. That is your unconscious doing it for you. But you can come to the point where you recognize, hey, this is causing me to react in this way. Why is it causing me to react in this way? What in my childhood may be triggering this? What was the circumstance involved with it, right? Shadow work. And all of that is, there's not a whole lot wrong in this. Now, some of this is trying to shoehorn in this concept with that concept, and that may not work perfectly. But it's not bad, right? There's nothing really here to disagree with. Or really, I mean, I do kind of agree with most of it, right? Even if I wouldn't have termed it exactly the same way, this is absolutely understandable, even in view of what he is not quite correctly portraying. All right. This far from simple situation derives partly from the fact of the ego has the paradoxical quality of being both the subject and the object of its own knowledge, and partly from the fact that the psyche is not a unity, but a constellation consisting of other luminaries besides the sun. The ego complex is not the only complex in the psyche. 386. Primitive assertion that the individual has a plurality of souls is in agreement with our findings. All right, you do not have a plurality of souls. This I am going to take exception to, right? It is not so much a constellation. We talked, I believe it was the last video, it might have been the one before. We talked about this. We talked about there is a coin that is not represented here, right? It is, but it's not, right? These 7 balls right here, these 7 colors, they represent coins, right? This is wrath and love. This is lust and chastity. This is gluttony and denial, greed and charity, pride and humility, sloth and diligence, hope and despair, right? The 7 virtues, the 7 vices, and they are coins. They are on opposite ends of each other. Lust and chastity, it's an easy one to understand, right? Sexual desire, denial of the sexual desire. Neither one is intrinsically good. You are to find the balance of a sacred union to share your soul with one particular person. There is another coin, and that coin is related to consciousness. One side of that coin is consciousness, and the other side is unconsciousness, but the source is the same. Your soul is individualized from God. He has assigned to your 5D navigation device, the temple of God, a soul, and that soul gets to make the decisions for the body. And you consciously do so. Whenever you say in your mind, I'm going to go over here and do this thing, that is you talking to yourself in your mind. But when you take an action and it's not quite right, and you're like, you shouldn't have done that, right? And most of the time, even, it portrays itself as outside of you. You'll say, instead of I'm going to go do this thing, you will say you shouldn't have done that thing, or you should do this thing. That is the unconscious talking to you. It is something deep within your psyche, on the other end of that coin, way over there, right? And you hear it dimly and distantly if you are not paying attention to it, but you can feed it to where it is louder. You hear those thoughts and then you make a decision about it. That is a recommendation, and you, on the other end of the coin, get to make the decision. Your consciousness is the ego complex. And what he is referring to here as the constellation is the other end of that coin. There is the voice of your parents. That is in there, right? There is the voice of your grandparents and your associates and your friends telling you things that they have told you before through your memory. But there's also an external voice that does the same thing in situations that you have not been in before. All of those voices, every single one of those, is the same thing on the other end of that coin, right? That is your unconscious using your mother's voice to remind you of the lesson. It is still just a recommendation. You get to make the decision upon it. That is what he is missing here, right? That understanding of the coin, of the understanding of this is you as the soul of God making decisions. And on the other end of that is you as the soul of God recommending. Look at it as your higher self or an oversoul, if that makes you comfortable. You can look at it as an angel on your shoulder. If you feed the voice that is telling you correct things, you will get more correct things. There is another voice that will tell you incorrect things. If you feed that one, you will hear more of that one. It is like those two wolves from the allegory. Whichever one you feed is the one that becomes, right? And so you will hear both sides of that. Do this thing, don't do this thing. In situational awareness, deep inside yourself, you have to choose which one of those you are going to listen to. And you intrinsically, in your soul, understand which one is good and which one is bad. You may still make the decision towards the bad because it is societally accepted to do so. That does not mean that it is a good choice. All of that is to say that this constellation, these understandings, is just because he didn't have the full understanding. I don't disagree with what is being said necessarily. I just think that it is framed in the wrong way. Again. All right. The possibility that unconscious complexes possess a certain luminosity, a kind of consciousness, cannot be dismissed out of hand, for they can easily give rise to something in the nature of secondary personalities, as psychopathological experience shows. But if this is possible, then observation of the ego complex from another standpoint, somewhere in the same psyche, is equally possible. As I have said, the critical portrayal of the ego complex in dreams and abnormal psychic states seems to be due to this. Do I have a pen up here? All right, we're going to use this pen as an example of this, right? Just because it is easier than using a coin. Right, so if we look at this, right, this pen has on one side of it the unconscious and on one side of it the conscious. You, most of the time, have about this much, right? Most of your actions come from the unconscious. Through this process that we are talking about, the things that I talk about in this book, the things that we're extrapolating in this video, you move this barrier farther this way. You will never reach all the way into your unconscious. But the more that you practice, the further down the line this becomes, and the greater your conscious decisions become, right? That is what this is talking about right here, in the opposite, right? If you allow the unconscious complexes to take possession, then you lose that consciousness, right? You act more and more from the unconscious side because you are feeding that particular wolf. And that is what causes these psychopathological complexes. That is what causes these split personalities and bipolar disorders. It is because you are feeding the wrong wolf. All right, back to the text. The conscious mind often knows little or nothing about its own transformation and does not want to know anything. That is true. If you are not consciously making the choice to make conscious choices, this is absolutely true. The more autocratic it is, and the more convinced of the eternal validity of its truths, the more it identifies with them. Thus, the kingship of soul, which is a natural phenomenon, passes to the human king, who personifies the prevailing dominant idea and must therefore share its fate. In the phenomenal world, the Heraclitean law of everlasting change prevails, and it seems that all the true things must change, and that only that which changes remains true. There's a lot of truth in that. Pitilessly, it is seen from another planet that the king is growing old, even before he sees it himself. Ruling ideas, the dominance, change, and the change undetected by consciousness is mirrored only in dreams. King Soul, as the archetype of consciousness, voyages through the world of the unconscious, one of its multitudinous figures, which may one day be capable of consciousness too. These lesser lights are, on the old view, identical with the planetary correspondences in the psyche, which were postulated by astrology. When, therefore, an alchemist conjured up the spirit of Saturn as his familiar, this was an attempt to bring to consciousness a standpoint outside the ego, involving a relativization of the ego and its contents. The intervention of the planetary spirit was besought as an aid. When the king grows old and needs renewing, a kind of planetary bath is instituted, a bath into which all the planets pour their influences. Footnote 387. Psychology and Alchemy. We'll be back at 389. This expresses the idea that the dominant, grown feeble with age, needs the support and influence of those subsidiary lights to fortify and renew it, as it is, as it were, dissolved in the substance of the other planetary archetypes and then put together again. Through this process of melting and recasting, there is formed a new amalgam of a more comprehensive nature, which has taken into itself the influences of the other planets or metals. And again, I don't really have a whole lot to argue with this, right? I don't have a lot to add. We have discussed most of this fairly extensively, right? Yeah, and I just don't have a whole lot to add to it, and so I'm not going to try. I mean, I'm not trying to add things where I can't bring value. I feel like he has explained that fairly well, right? We have discussed the parts that I would. So, in this alchemical picture, we can easily recognize the projection of the transformation process. The aging of the psychic dominant is apparent from the fact that it expresses the psychic totality in ever-diminishing degree. One can also say that the psyche no longer feels wholly contained in the dominant, whereupon the dominant loses its fascination and no longer grips the psyche so completely as before. On the other hand, its content and meaning are no longer properly understood, or what is understood fails to touch the heart. A sentiment d'incomplétude is the kind produces this compensatory reaction which attracts other regions of the psyche and their contents, so as to fill up the gap. As a rule, this is an unconscious process that always sets in when the attitude and orientation of the conscious mind have proved inadequate. I stress this point because the conscious mind is a bad judge of its own situation and often persists in the illusion that its attitude is just the right one and is only prevented from working because of some external annoyance. That is most certainly true. I mean, the conscious mind is a bad judge of its own situation and often persists in the illusion that its attitude is the right one and is only prevented from working because of some external annoyance. That is so very true. Now, that becomes less true the more that you take charge of that consciousness. And so that is one of the reasons why you should, right? There's plenty of reason in here why you should be taking control of your own conscious decisions and exploring your unconscious. If the dreams were observed, it would soon become clear why the conscious assumptions have become unworkable. And if finally neurotic symptoms appear, then the attitude of consciousness, its ruling idea, is contradicted. And in the unconscious, there is a stirring up of those archetypes that were the most suppressed by the conscious attitude. The therapist then has no other course than to confront the ego with its adversary, and thus initiated the melting and recasting process. The confrontation is expressed in the alchemical myth of the king as the collision of the masculine, spiritual father world ruled over by King Soul with the feminine, chthonic mother world symbolized by the aqua permanence, or by the chaos. And again, I am not in disagreement with this, right? This is more of the physical side of it than the spiritual side of it that I normally deal with. But this is true, right? This is all things. Down to the alchemical myth of soul and the mother here being represented correctly, right? The soul is the change, the masculine force of change that begins, and the feminine is the chaos or the void into which the change occurs. The illegitimate aspect of this relationship appears as incest, veiled in the cantilena by adoption, which nevertheless results in the pregnancy of the mother. And again, I completely disagree with anything being talked about with incest as a good thing, even in allegorical language for alchemy, right? I know why does not make it correct. As I have explained elsewhere, incest expresses the union of elements that are akin or of the same nature. That is to say, the adversary of soul in his own feminine chthonic aspect, which he has forgotten. Soul's reflected light is the feminine Luna, who dissolves the king in her moistness. It is as though Saul had to descend into the watery deep of the sublunary world in order to unite the powers of above and below, as in Faust's journey to the mothers. We talk quite often about binding together those powers. The as below are these bottom three, the as above are the top three, and this one right here in the middle, that is the binder. That is the lapis, the philosopher's stone. The unworkable conscious dominant appears in menacing fashion among the contents rising up from the unconscious, thus bringing about a darkening of the light. And I want to point out too, right, even looking at it in the way that I do, right, this is feminine, this is masculine. When I do what I do, as we describe, right, I pull the energy from the void first. The feminine energy comes up, and then we balance each and every one of these, mainly concentrating on the vices first, right? And then we come back down, consciously focusing upon the virtues. This is this, as being described, even though the terminology is not quite the same, it is really the same thing, right? The one workable conscious dominant disappearing in menacing fashion among the contents rising up from the unconscious. That is the shadow work, the balancing of the vices, bringing about a darkening of the light, right? When you bring the balance to your darker parts, it brings more darkness in. But you're also going to be bringing in the balance to the lightning parts, and so there will be a balance stricken. And so I do not disagree with that. The warring elements of primeval chaos are unleashed as though they had never been subjugated. I absolutely agree with that. The battle is fought out between the dominant and the contents of the unconscious so violently that reason would like to clamp down on unreason. And again, this is the process. But you take control of it, right? It starts off outside of your control, and that is violent, right? When you start recognizing your wrath, when you start recognizing your lust, when you start recognizing your gluttony, your body will violently react. You will not like the fact that that is a thing in your life, the unconscious. And the contents of the unconscious so violently that reason would like to clamp down on unreason. But these attempts fail and go on failing until the ego acknowledges its impotence and lets the furious battle of psychic powers go its own way. I do not agree with that. Right? The intrinsic part of this is the understanding that you do have these impulses, right? You do have wrathful impulses. I don't care who you are. You have thought about killing someone at some point. Almost exclusively, right? There's always those vanishing percentages of people who don't. But overwhelming majority, 99.999, even those 5 nines, almost certainly have had an experience at least one time of extreme anger, wanting to injure someone else. Some people act upon it, but most people don't. All right. Once you realize that that is part of your life, it becomes uncomfortable. It becomes a violence in your soul. It is something that you have to balance within yourself. And the only way to truly balance that is to take conscious understanding of it. To go in and root source, why does this particular situation make me react in this particular way? It is probably linked to your childhood. There is almost certainly something, that happened to you before the age of 8 or at the age of 8 or below. And that is when your patterns really get set. There is almost certainly something back there that you have to work through. You cannot do that unconsciously. It can begin unconsciously, but it cannot end unconsciously. And so, for me, in the way that I have balanced myself, this is not true, right? These attempts do fail, and they go on failing until the ego acknowledges its power and lets the furious battle of psychic powers go its way. Right? Not its own way, but the ego's way, until you are consciously making those decisions for yourself. Then the attempts will fail. But once you are understanding, hey, this is triggering this thing that happened to me, I can work through this without violent extremities. Until that happens, then the unconscious will keep it failing. But once you have reached the point where you can identify these triggers, you are responsible for them, yes, but you making conscious decisions about them instead of just listening to that voice saying, go angry, right? Once you can do that, then you're making the conscious ego-driven, acknowledging the power of your choice. This I disagree with. If the ego does not interfere with its irritating rationality, the opposites, just because they are in conflict, will gradually draw together, and what look like death and destruction will settle down into a latent state of concord, suitably expressed by the symbol of pregnancy. Footnote 389. The phase of the conflict of opposites is usually represented by fighting animals, such as the lion, dragon, wolf, and dog. In consequence, the king, the previous dominant of consciousness, is transformed into a real and workable whole, whereas before he had only pretended to wholeness. And I agree with that part, with the exception of what I just stated. The Cantilena shows us what the dominant was, which is subjected to transformation not only in Ripley, but in many other alchemists. It was the Christian view of the world in the Middle Ages. And again, I will point out that that is not necessarily true. They had to couch their language in Christianity so that they could keep their heads attached to their bodies. This problem is of such dimensions that one cannot expect a medieval man to have been even remotely conscious of it. It was bound to work itself out in projection unconsciously. For this reason, too, it can hardly be grasped, even today, which is why the psychological interpretation of the one, the filius regius, meets with the greatest difficulties. From the hymn-like manner in which the alchemists praised their son, it is quite evident that they meant by this symbol either Christ himself or something that corresponded to him. I would say that it was something that corresponded to him, which is the philosopher's stone, right? Naturally, they were not concerned with the historical personality of Jesus, which at that time was completely covered up by the dogmatic figure of the second person of the Trinity. Not in disagreement with that. There is what Jesus taught, and there are the things that are taught about Jesus, and those things are not necessarily the same. Jesus came quite explicitly telling you repeatedly to turn to God, not him. He never once told you to pray in Jesus' name to do things, right? He did say, if you ask in my name, but that was something that was probably attributed to him that was not necessarily correct, because most of the sayings that he has is, I'm here to do my Father's work. I am here on the Father's work. Turn to the Father. Repent ye and turn your eyes to the Lord, right? It was a repeated pattern of turning back to God, not necessarily to anything representative on the earth. Then there was what was said about him. What was said about him is all of the stuff that's not written in red. And those can be completely different than what he said. See, the Bible study of that is confusing. The latter symbol had slowly crystallized out in the course of the centuries, though it was clearly prefigured in the logos of St. John. And once again, I will point out that this is completely misunderstood with no reservation upon my part. Logos was never a man. Never fully a man, right? I am a representative of the Logos. You are a representative of the Logos. This glass and its contents represented, and the air all the way around me represented. All of the light in this room represented, and the sound that you hear coming from my voice represents it. The Logos is every single instance of change, life, light, Logos, like all of the change, all of the fire, all of that is Logos. It has never been and will never be confined to any one person at all. There was the Word that God used to create. That is the Logos. It is not a person. Anyone telling you that it is telling you the wrong thing. They may have the wrong understanding, or they may just simply be lying to you, because I hold that there's only two types of pastors out there teaching Christianity. There are the ones that are too stupid to understand that they are teaching the wrong thing, and there are those that are well aware that they are teaching the wrong thing and are doing it anyway. They have gone through the school to apologize. Nor was the conception of God as senex and pure peculiar to the alchemist, for many clerics who were not alchemists took it as a transformation of the wrathful and vindictive Yahweh of the Old Testament into the God of love of the New. Thus, the archetype of the king's renewal manifested itself not only among the philosophers, but also in ecclesiastical circles. Footnote 390. Psychology and Alchemy. We'll be back at 392. There can be a psychological explanation of the Filius Regius only when this image is sloughed off in its projected form and become a purely psychic experience. The Christ Lapis parallel shows clearly enough that the Filius Regius was a more psychic event than a physical one, since, as a physical event, it can demonstrably never occur, and as a religious experience, it is beyond question. There are many passages in the text that can be interpreted, strange as this may sound, as an experience of Christ in matter. Yeah, that is because Christ has been misrepresented. Right? Christ as the representative of Logos is not any one particular person, right? There is the Christ Spirit. And I don't really like using that, right? But it is a thing. That is one of the allegories that is used. If you are not looking at it as a man, but instead as the spirit of change, then it works, right? But if you look at it as a man, it does not. This many passages in the text that can be interpreted as an experience of Christ in matter is quite literally the things that I talk about in here, right? If you can read the title of this, it is a series of unconventional beliefs, and then it says A Beginner's Guide to the Mechanics of Electromagnetic Manipulation, or Manipulation and Energetic Manifestation, right? The Christ in matter is the electromagnetics. That is quite often referred to, right? Many passages, Christ in matter. That is the element of change contained within the elements. And that works. As a person, it can't work. And that is one of the very many reasons why Christ was not the Redeemer. Others, again, lay so much emphasis on the lapis that one cannot but see in it a renewal and completion of the dogmatic image. Wrong. An unequivocal substitution of the Filius Regius for Christ does not, to my knowledge, occur in the literature, for which reason one must call alchemy Christian, even though heretical. I do not call alchemy Christian at all. As I have explained many times, The only reason that they used the language of Christianity was to keep their head on their shoulders. If you did not use the language of Christianity in the 1600s, then you went through torture. It is that simple. Right? People still do that today. The Christ lapis remains an ambiguous figure. This is of considerable importance as it regards a psychological interpretation of the Filius Regis. In any such view, the place of matter, with its magical fascination, is taken by the unconscious, which was projected into it. For our modern consciousness, the dogmatic image of Christ changed, under the influence of evangelical Protestantism, into the personal Jesus, who, in liberal rationalism, which abhorred all mysticism, gradually faded into a mere ethical prototype. The disappearance of the feminine element, namely the cult of the Mother of God in Protestantism, was all that was needed for the spirituality of the dogmatic image to detach itself from the earthly man and gradually sink into the unconscious. When such great and significant images fall into oblivion, they do not disappear from the human sphere, nor do they lose their psychic power. Anyone in the Middle Ages who was familiar with the mysticism of alchemy remained in contact with the living dogma, even if he was a Protestant. This is probably the reason why alchemy reached its heyday at the end of the 16th and in the 17th century. For the Protestant, it was the only way of still being Catholic. You were assuming that they wanted to, and they did not, right? I do not agree with Protestantism in the way that it has been executed. That is because my understanding of God is much different than theirs. But it is beyond argument that the Protestants were very firmly separating themselves from Christianity. A thorough reading of the Bible, which most people have not done, a thorough objective reading of the Bible, which almost no one has done, will reveal to you that if you take the teachings of Christ and you take all of the Gospels in concordance with where they are supposed to be, which, by the way, Paul probably should not be attached at all, and it gets rid of a lot of the letters, right? If you take the people that studied at the feet of Jesus and the works of Jesus and the words of Jesus, and then you compare them to Catholic rituals, rites, and dogma, you will find that they are directly contradictory to one another. There is almost nothing that is identifiable in the Catholic Church as coming from Christ at all. There is some overlap because they have the appearance of generosity. It is only an appearance. They have the appearance of taking the right actions. And again, that is only an appearance. Their very foundations by being asexual, not having sex, not supposed to have sex, right? They definitely have no problems impregnating nuns or children. And so that whole issue, right? There is almost nothing identifiable from the Gospels or from the words of Jesus himself in the dogma of the Catholic Church. You can make extrapolations and apologies and make it fit if you really try. But for the most part, you can't. And Martin Luther recognized that. He recognized all of these contradictions. I forget how many it was. It was like 40 something, I think. And he nailed them to the wall or to the door of the church. Here are all the problems with your dogmas. That was the beginning of the separation of the Protestantism. And there is no point of a Protestant wanting to be Catholic. That is a completely fallacious understanding. I mean, that is not to say that it doesn't happen. People make wrong decisions all of the time. If you are Catholic, you are more wrong than a Protestant, and a Protestant is still wrong. And again, I know that steps on toes. It is one of those things that I do not apologize for. See the Bible study? We did the work. In the Opus Alchemicum, he still had a completely valid transformation rite and a concrete mystery. But alchemy did not flourish only in Protestant countries. In Catholic France, it was still widely practiced during the 18th century, as numerous manuscripts and published works testify, such as those of Don Pernety, Linglet de Fresnoy, and the great compilation of Manger, published in 1702. This is not surprising, as in France at that time the modern anti-Christian schism was brewing, which was to culminate in the Revolution, that relatively harmless prelude to the horrors of today. The decline of alchemy during the Enlightenment meant for many Europeans the descent of all dogmatic images, which till then had been directly present in the ostensible secrets of chemical matter, to the underworld. I do want to point out that this is after the Protestant Revolution. The Protestant Reformation, I wouldn't necessarily call it a revolution, right? Still widely practiced during the 18th century, was well after Protestantism was established, and therefore the Catholic Church had zero choice but to relax some of their rules. That is an important thing. Just as the decay of the conscious dominant is followed by an eruption of chaos in the individual, footnote 391. Oh, we're not back yet. 392. We'll be back at 392. So also in the case of the masses, peasant wars, Anabaptist, French Revolution, etc., and in the furious conflict developments in the individual psyche, is reflected in the unleashing of primeval bloodthirstiness and lust for murder on a collective scale. Just as the decay of the conscious dominant is followed by an eruption of chaos in the individual, so also in the case of the masses and the furious conflict developments in the individual psyche is reflected in the unleashing of primeval bloodthirstiness and lust for murder on a collective scale. This is the sickness so vividly described in the Cantilena. The loss of the eternal images is in truth no light matter for the man of discernment. So this is blaming war on the breaking apart, right? That is acting like the Catholic Church as a body did not institute a lot of wars. And I'm not talking about the Crusades, right? The Crusades was a justified reclaiming of Europe and a somewhat arguable penetration into the lands held by the conqueror in order to discourage them from coming back. But the oppression of the Israelites when they conquered a large chunk of Europe left no choice but the Crusades, right? Now, that is not to say that they were executed correctly. That is not to say that it was even necessarily a good thing, but it is perfectly understandable why it had to happen, considering the circumstances of the time. And so I'm not looking at that. But when Constantine decided to take over the Germanic tribes as a representative of Christ in the establishment of the Catholic Church, they instituted wars against the pagans that lived there. They instituted wars against the pagans of France. They instituted war against the pagans of Poland and Bosnia, against the pagans in England and Ireland, right? They instituted war against everybody that they met, up until the point of Protestantism, where they were no longer the dominant force, to attribute to the loss of this particular divine system, which is what he is saying here from my understanding, is fucking stupid. That is completely dismissing the absolute bloody horror that is the Catholic Church. But since there are infinitely many more men of no discernment, nobody, apparently, notices that the truth expressed by the dogma has vanished in the cloud of fog, and nobody seems to miss anything. The discerning person knows and feels that his psyche is disquieted by the loss of something that was the lifeblood of his ancestors. The undiscerning miss nothing. and only discover afterwards, in the papers, much too late, the alarming symptoms that have now become real in the outside world because they were not perceived before inside, in oneself, just as the presence of the eternal images was not noticed. If they had been hold on, Trinity, that has to be a misprint. I am unfamiliar. Let's see if that is a word, just in case it is just something I don't know, but I doubt it. That was probably just wrong. Okay, I learned a new word today. You learn something new every day. Trinity. A poem or a song, a mourning or lamentation. A three-note. Interesting. Okay, if they had been a trinity, for the lost god would have arisen, as once before in antiquity at the death of the great Pan. 392. In late antiquity, Pan was no longer a grotesque pastoral deity, but had taken on a philosophical significance. The Nassenes regarded him as one of the forms of the many-formed Datus, and as synonymous with Osiris, Sophia, Adam, Corybus, Papag, Bacchaeus, etc. The story of the dirge is in Plutarch, the obsolescence of oracles, Psychology and Religion. Its modern equivalent is Zarathustra's cry, God is dead. God is dead, we have killed him. And it is a lamentable experience. Something along those lines, right? He was not celebrating that God was dead. That is a complete misunderstanding of what was done. We have gone through the works of Nietzsche, not all of them, but Spake Zarathustra, we did in its entirety. There are a lot of problems contained in there. It is quite evident that Nietzsche was 100% antithetical to God in the forms of the control systems, whether that be Catholic or Protestant. He did, however, seek God. He did not find him. That was his problem. We have discussed that in some extreme detail as we were going through. He had a lot of issues, and these Thus Spake Zarathustra is definitely a study that is worth going through. If you are particularly dealing with despair, depression, or even anxiety, that is a very good one to go through because he suffered from those things with almost no respite. Instead, all well-meaning people assure us that one has only to believe he is still there, which merely adds stupidity to unconsciousness. Wait. Once the systems are really outside in some form of socio-political insanity, right? This is lamenting the loss of the Catholic doctrine, and I am not in accordance with that, right? Now, there is a loss of responsibility that did go along with that, right? That led to the atheism movement, which is not necessarily a good one. This part, right, one has only to believe he is still there. Now, if you are talking about the great Pan as a physical entity, that is stupid, right? I'm not going to couch it. But if you are looking at it as the forces of nature, it is still there, right? If you are looking at it as a representative of the one true God through the opposing forces of domestication and wildness, then it is still there, right? That is not stupidity. But if you're looking for it as a literal representative in physical form, then that is stupidity. Once the symptoms are really outside in some form of socio-political insanity, it is impossible to convince anybody that the conflict is in the psyche of every individual, since he is now quite sure where his enemy is. Then, the conflict which remains an intrapsychic phenomenon in the mind of the discerning person takes place on the plane of projection in the form of political tension and murderous violence. To produce such consequences, the individual must have been thoroughly indoctrinated with the insignificance and worthlessness of his psyche and of psychology in general. And that is not something that I do, right? Psyche and psychology, not necessarily the same thing, but both important. One must preach at him from all the pulpits of authority that salvation always comes from outside and that the meaning of his existence lies in his community. That is one of the things that I absolutely talk against, right? Personal responsibility beats putting it on someone else every single time. That does not mean that other people are not responsible at times for circumstances. But even in those circumstances, there is something that you need to take responsibility for. Right? If you are listening to someone who is giving you bad advice, you have to take responsibility for listening to that, not giving the due consideration. He can then be led docilely to the place where of his own natural accord he would rather go anyway, to the land of childhood, where one makes claims exclusively on others, and where, if done wrong, it is always somebody else who has done it. And once again, we get to the intrinsic difference between Freud and Jung. Right? We started this study with that. Freud wants to blame anyone and everyone else. Jung wants you to take responsibility for yourself. It is the intrinsic difference between the two systems. And it is infinitely easier to blame someone else than to take responsibility for yourself. That is why the control systems are so dominant. When he no longer knows by what his soul is sustained, the potential of the unconscious is increased to take the lead. Desirousness overpowers him, and illusory goals set up in the place of eternal images excite his greed. The beast of prey seizes hold of him and soon makes him forget that he is a human being. His animal effects hamper any reflection that might stand in the way of his infantile wish fulfillments, filling him instead with a feeling of new won right to existence, and intoxicating him with the lust for booty and blood. And again, I will point out that the atheism movement is not necessarily a good one. I believe in God. Right? That God is not defined by Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Buddhism. It is beyond even my definition. Right? I have a definition that I give in chapter 1 of here. I have a video that will be linked. The divine and the Trinity explained. It will be linked up here. That is my understanding of the divine. It's not like the understanding. It is one that has allowed me to come to the place where I am. And so, for the most part, right, if you look at this and take away the specificity of Catholicism and the doctrines that were put in place for that, and you look instead as the seeking of God and the not, right? This, what he is describing, is the not seeking of any God. It is the not aligning yourself with any moral authority. And that does lead that way, right? That is feeding that wolf that brings you down the spiral of choice. There's one at the top, there's one at the bottom. You get to choose which one to listen to, right? If you are not seeking God, you will listen to the one that brings you down. That is true. And so in that sense, in that context, I agree with this. But not, most definitely not, as a reference to Catholicism. Only the living presence of the eternal images can lend the human psyche a dignity which makes it morally possible for a man to stand by his own soul, and be convinced that it is worth his while to persevere with it. Only then will he realize that the conflict is in him, that the discord and tribulation are his riches which should not be squandered by attacking others, and that if fate should exact a debt from him in the form of guilt, it is a debt to himself. Then he will recognize the worth of his psyche, for nobody can know a debt to a mere nothing. But when he loses his own values, he becomes a hungry robber. The wolf, lion, and other ravening beasts, which for the alchemist symbolize the appetites that break loose when the black waters of chaos, an example, the unconsciousness of projection, have swallowed up the king. Footnote 293. 393. In the midst of the chaos, a small globe is happily indicated, and this is the supreme point of junction for all that is useful for this quest. This small place, more efficient than all the eternity, is this pot which comprises its whole, this accessory more abundant than its principle, on opening the store of its treasures, causes the two substances to appear, which are but a single one. Of these two is composed the unique perfect, the simple abundant, the composite without parts. The only indivisible hatchet of the sages from which emerges the scroll of destiny, extending evenly beyond the chaos, after which it advances in ordered fashion to its rightful end. In these words, Borel de Verville describes the germ of unity in the unconscious. And that is not bad, right? In the midst of chaos, in the void, a small globe is happily indicated. Into the void penetrates a light. And this is the supreme point of junction for all that is useful in this quest. That's the logos. This small place, more efficient than all the entirety, is the part which comprises its whole. Right? The two substances to appear, which are but a single one. Right? I'm holding this book up for a reason. If you have not been hanging around, these symbols represent this. And so I am in agreement with this, even though I don't know that he has the context right. It is a subtle feature of the Cantilena that the pregnancy cravings of the mother are still with peacock's flesh and lion's blood. In example, with her own flesh and blood. 394. Because of his fiery nature, the lion is the affective animal, par excellence. The drinking of the blood, the essence of the lion, is therefore like assimilating one's own effects. Through the wound, the lion is tapped, so to speak. The affect is pierced by the well-aimed thrust of the weapon, insight, which sees through the motive for the effect. In alchemy, the wounding or mutilation of the lion signifies the subjugation of concupiscence. If the projected conflict is to be healed, it must return into the psyche of the individual, where it had its unconscious beginnings. He must celebrate a last supper with himself and eat his own flesh and drink his own blood, which means that he must recognize and accept the other in himself. And I do not agree with the allegory, right? I do not like the image of giving or drinking your own blood, eating your own flesh. Any type of blood magic, even symbolical, is going to be intrinsically evil. But if he persists in his one-sidedness, the two lions will tear each other to pieces. Is this perhaps the meaning of Christ's teachings, that each must bear his own cross? For if you have to endure yourself, how will you be able to rend others also? Such reflections are justified by the alchemical symbolism, as one can easily see if one examines these so-called allegories a little more closely, and does not dismiss them at the start as worthless rubbish. The miraculous feeding with one's own substance, so strangely reflecting its prototype, Christ, means nothing less than the integration of those parts of the personality which are still outside ego consciousness. Lion and peacock, emblems of concupiscence and pride, signify the overweening pretensions of the human shadow, which we so gladly project on our fellow man in order to visit our own sins upon him with apparent justification. In the age-old image of the Ouroboros lies the thought of devouring oneself and turning oneself into a circulatory process. For it was clear to the more astute alchemist that the primal materia of the art was man himself. I am not in disagreement with that. 395. Thus Morinius states, "This thing is extracted from thee, for thou art its ore. In thee they find it. And to speak more plainly, from thee they take it. And when thou hast experienced this, the love and desire for it will be increased in thee. And thou shalt know that this thing subsists truly and beyond all doubt." I am in agreement. The Ouroboros is a dramatic symbol for the integration and assimilation of the opposite, an example of the shadow. This feedback process is at the same time a symbol of immortality, since it is said of the Ouroboros that he slays himself and brings himself to life, fertilizes himself and gives birth to himself. He symbolizes the one who proceeds from the clash of opposites and therefore constitutes the secret of the prima materia, which, as a projection, unquestionably stems from man's unconscious. Accordingly, there must be some psychic datum in which it gives rise to such assertions, and these assertions must somehow characterize that datum even if they are not to be taken literally. What the ultimate reason is for these assertions, or manifestations, must remain a mystery, but a mystery whose kinship with the mystery of faith was sensed by the adepts, so that, for them, the two were identical. And that is going to bring us to the end of part 7. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat complicated topics. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. I don't have a whole lot to add here, right? We have, I feel, explained things fairly well. It is important to understand the Catholic understanding is one of the ones that I am firm was not correct, right? Even their own source material contradicts their dogmas, contradicts everything that they stand for. It is one of those things that I do have to stand on, even if it offends every single person ever. I mean, I feel like I have explained those things well enough. If I haven't, drop it in the box and we'll talk about it. But I really do feel like we've explained these things well enough as we've gone along. And so I don't have a whole lot to add. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that was said, put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of my book, or contacting me directly through the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.